The auctioneer's gavel had barely risen when Eva Townsend realized that among the dozen men gathered in the dusty square of Caldwell, Kansas, on that blistering afternoon in the summer of 1874, only one of them had looked her in the eyes before he raised his hand to bid. The others had looked at her the way men looked at horses or parcels of land, appraising her waist and her teeth and the color of her hair, calculating worth in livestock terms, deciding what she might fetch on the open market of a desperate woman's circumstance. But this man, standing slightly apart from the others at the edge of the crowd, had looked directly into her eyes with an expression that was neither hungry nor calculating. It was something closer to sorrow, something that told her he understood, even if she could not have explained it herself, exactly what it felt like to be standing on a wooden platform in front of strangers with the sun hammering down and no good options left. His name was Cecil Ford, and she would not learn that for another hour. Eva Townsend had not arrived at this particular moment in her life without considerable suffering. She was 24 years old, dark-haired, with a spine that stayed straight even when everything around her was collapsing, which it had been doing in increments for the past 2 years. Her father, James Townsend, had been a farmer outside of Wichita, a decent man who worked harder than the land ever rewarded him for. He had died of fever in the autumn of 1872, leaving behind $300 in debt, a mule with a broken leg, and Eva, who was his only surviving child after her brother Thomas had been taken by a creek flood at the age of 12. Her mother had been gone since Eva was 6. She had tried to manage the farm alone. She had tried to sell it. She had tried 3 different arrangements that all fell through because the bank held liens she hadn't known about, and because the men who promised to help had their own interests that ran contrary to hers. By the spring of 1874, she had been left with nothing but the clothes on her back, a small leather satchel containing a locket of her mother's and 2 letters she kept for sentimental reasons, and the grim knowledge that a woman alone in the Kansas territory with no money and no land had very few dignified roads available to her. She had heard about the arrangement from a woman named Martha Greer who ran a boarding house in Wichita. Martha was a practical woman with no patience for poetry but considerable experience with survival, and she had explained the situation plainly. There were men out on the frontier, ranchers and homesteaders and small-town merchants, who needed wives and who had no means of finding them through ordinary courtship, because they were too far from civilization or too busy keeping themselves alive. There were brokers who arranged introductions, and sometimes when those introductions didn't produce results quickly enough, there were auctions. Martha had said the word without blinking. Eva had blinked. But 2 days later, when the bank had sent its final notice, and the boarding house had gently suggested she find other accommodations, she had gone back to Martha and asked for the broker's name. His name was Elias Prout, and he operated out of Caldwell, which sat at the edge of the Kisham Trail where it crossed into Indian Territory to the south. He was a fat man with a gold tooth, and the kind of cheerfulness that belonged to men who had long since stopped thinking of other people as fully real. He had explained that the auction was a formality, that the man who won the bid was expected to provide a home and a fair arrangement, that it was legally binding in so far as these things were ever legally binding, and that Eva would have the right to refuse if the winning bidder was demonstrably unsuitable. She had asked what demonstrably unsuitable meant. He had said that if the man arrived to collect her and was drunk or covered in blood, she could walk away. She had spent the 2 weeks before the auction trying not to think about it too carefully because careful thinking in her position felt like standing on a frozen pond and stamping your feet to test the ice. And so here she stood in the town square of Caldwell, Kansas, on a Thursday afternoon in late June, the temperature pushing past 90 degrees, in a dress that was clean but faded, with her hair pinned up properly and her hands folded in front of her to keep them from shaking. She counted 11 men in the crowd. Some were ranchers, judging by their boots and their weathered skin. Two looked like they might be merchants. One was clearly drunk before noon. Elia's Prout had climbed onto the platform with her, which she found unbearable, and was describing her attributes in the way that auctioneer language described anything, with enthusiasm untethered from dignity. She kept her eyes fixed on the middle distance, above the heads of the gathered men, until the bidding started. That was when she made the mistake of looking down. Most of the men were already looking at her chest or her hips, or were consulting each other with the sidelong looks of men calculating a purchase. But one man, standing at the far edge of the loose crowd, was looking at her face. Specifically, he was looking at her eyes, and when she met his gaze, he didn't look away and he didn't leer and he didn't smirk. He simply held her gaze with an expression that she could only later describe as steady, like a man who had decided on something and was waiting to act on it. He was tall without being enormous, with the kind of lean build that came from hard outdoor work rather than from youth. She guessed him to be around 30, maybe a year or two older. He wore a brown hat that had seen considerable weather, a plain canvas shirt, and the kind of worn boots that meant he'd covered distance on horseback. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something resistant and dark eyes under the shadow of his hat brim. The bidding started at $20. She hated that she knew what the bidding started at. She hated every part of this, but she kept her spine straight. Several men raised their hands. The drunk one dropped out quickly at 35. Two merchants haggled briefly and then one of them shrugged and walked away. The bidding climbed to $50 and the crowd thinned. At $60 there were 3 men left, and then the man at the edge of the crowd who had not bid yet, who had continued looking at her steadily through the whole proceeding, raised his hand for the first time. He raised it at $65. His voice, when he spoke the number, was low and unhurried, not aggressive, not performative. He said 65 like it was a fact he was reporting, and when the other 2 men glanced at him, something in his manner caused one of them to immediately drop out. The other went to 70. The man at the edge said 80. There was a pause. The remaining bidder looked at him again, seemed to measure something, and shook his head slightly. He walked away. Elia's Prout announced Cecil Ford as the winning bidder with the gold-toothed enthusiasm of a man who had never spent a single second in genuine discomfort. And Eva Townsend stood on that platform under the Kansas sun, and breathed slowly, and tried to figure out what a man like that wanted with a woman like her, when he could have bid on a horse and paid less. Cecil Ford approached the platform with his hat in his hands, which she noticed. Men who held their hats when approaching a woman rather than keeping them on their heads were acknowledging something, even if they couldn't name it. He looked up at her from the base of the platform steps and he said, "Miss Townsend, my name is Cecil Ford. I have a ranch outside of town, about 11 miles south toward the territory line. I want you to know that I bid honestly and I'll behave honestly, and if after you've heard my situation you'd rather walk away, I'll make sure Prout returns your arrangement to you clean." Eva looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "What's your situation?" He told her, right there, standing at the foot of the auction platform while Elia's Prout hovered nearby looking faintly irritated. Cecil Ford had a cattle ranch called the Double Creek, named for the 2 small seasonal creeks that bordered its north and east edges. He ran 400 head, had 3 working hands, and had been operating it alone since his wife had died 2 years ago of a fever that had moved through the territory fast and cruel. He had a daughter, 7 years old, named Ruth, who was currently being looked after by a neighboring family because Cecil had made the 10-mile trip into Caldwell for this specific purpose. He needed a woman who could manage a household and help raise his daughter, and he would provide a proper home, food, fair treatment, and whatever legal arrangement she required. He said all of this without romance and without apology, which Eva respected more than either would have supplied. She said, "I'd like to see the ranch before I agree to anything." He nodded once. "That's fair." Elia's Prout made a noise about formalities and paperwork, and Cecil Ford turned a look on him that silenced the noise efficiently. Then he helped Eva down from the platform, and she noticed that he offered his hand rather than taking her arm, which again was a kind of courtesy that cost nothing but communicated a great deal. They rode out of Caldwell together in the late afternoon, Cecil on a bay horse and Eva in the back of a flatbed wagon driven by one of his hands, a quiet man named Deke who spoke only when required and seemed to find silence entirely comfortable. The Kansas landscape spread out around them in waves of tall grass and heat shimmer, the sky enormous and pale blue above the horizon. Eva sat with her satchel in her lap and watched the land pass and thought about what she was doing with the careful and deliberate thinking of someone crossing that frozen pond and refusing to look down. The Double Creek Ranch appeared after 11 miles as a cluster of low buildings set against a rise, cottonwood trees along the near creek throwing long shadows in the evening light. There was a proper house, not a soddy, which told her that Cecil Ford had been here long enough to build something and had cared enough to build it well. It was modest but solid, with a real porch and glass windows, which were not cheap to transport out this far. There was a barn, a bunkhouse for the hands, a smoke house, a vegetable garden that had been tended recently but was beginning to show signs of needing a more consistent hand. Cecil's daughter Ruth was brought over by the neighboring family within the hour, and Eva's first sight of her was of a small girl with her father's dark eyes and her mother's light hair, according to a photograph on the mantel that Eva would study later, standing at the edge of the porch with the combination of intense curiosity and careful suspicion that children employed when they were smart enough to know that a new adult in their world required careful assessment. Ruth did not speak to Eva that first evening. She watched her from a distance with those dark eyes, and Eva did not push because she understood completely what it meant to lose a mother and to be cautious about replacement. Cecil showed Eva the house, which was clean in the way that a man who tried but didn't have the time for thorough attention kept things clean. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a real stove, 2 bedrooms, and a small back room that had been used for storage. He told her that the larger bedroom had been his wife's and his, but that he had moved to the smaller one after she passed, and it had stayed that way. He told her this plainly, without embarrassment, and Eva appreciated that he did not pretend the past out of existence. He said she could have the larger bedroom, that the arrangement would be whatever she was comfortable with, that he was not the kind of man to make demands. He said this looking at the wall slightly to the left of her face, which was the first time she had seen him look away from her eyes, and she understood that this part of the conversation was harder for him than the rest had been. She said, "I appreciate that. I'll take the larger room." He nodded and said supper would be ready in an hour if she wanted to get settled. She unpacked her satchel, which took approximately 3 minutes, and set her mother's locket on the dresser and put her 2 letters in the drawer and sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the sounds of the ranch through the window. Cattle in the distance, the creak of the porch, Ruth's voice asking her father something in a low voice and his answer, too quiet to hear. She was not happy exactly. But she was not desperate, which was an improvement on the past several months, and improvement was something she knew how to work with. The first few days at the Double Creek had a careful, procedural quality, like 2 people working alongside each other in a room that contained an undetonated, something neither of them was quite ready to examine. Eva threw herself into the household with the energy of someone who had been without purpose for too long and found it clarifying to have work to do. She cleaned thoroughly, reorganized the kitchen in a way that made the cooking substantially more efficient, repaired 3 things that had been gently broken for some time, including a cabinet hinge and a torn window screen, and began working on the vegetable garden with a systematic attention that Deke, passing one morning, observed with visible approval. Ruth watched all of this from various positions of strategic observation, which is to say, she was almost always nearby, but never quite where you'd expect a child to be. And she had opinions she expressed through facial expressions, without committing them to words. On the third morning she appeared in the kitchen while Eva was making biscuits and stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, and Eva said without looking up from the dough, "I make them with a little extra lard so they come out flakier. Your father told me you like biscuits." Ruth said, "Mama made them different." Eva said, "I know. I won't try to make them the same way. You can tell me if you want them changed." There was a long pause, and then Ruth uncrossed her arms and came to stand beside the table. She didn't ask to help, but she watched with the focused attention of a child storing information. Cecil noticed all of these things in the way a man notices things he's been careful not to seem to be paying too much attention to. He was up before dawn and usually back from the range by supper, and the meals that were waiting when he came in were a different quality of experience than the ones he had been managing on his own, which had been adequate but joyless. Not that he thought about it in terms of joy, particularly. He thought about it in terms of the fact that Ruth was eating better and seemed to be sleeping without waking in the night as often, and that the house had a different quality of inhabitedness that was hard to define but was unmistakably present. On the sixth evening after Ruth had been put to bed, Cecil and Eva sat on the porch in the cooling dark, and he asked her without preamble what she had been before the farm failed. She told him. She told him about her father and the farm and the fever and the debt and the bank. She told him without self-pity, just the facts in order, and he listened without interrupting, which was rare enough in her experience to be notable. When she finished, he said, "I'm sorry. That's a long run of hard." She said it was. "What about you?" So he told her. He had come out from Tennessee at 22 with $120 he'd saved working on the railroad, and a letter from a cousin who knew someone who knew of available land near the territory line. He had built the Double Creek from nothing over 6 years. He had met his wife, Clara, in Caldwell when she was visiting her brother, and she had been brave enough to come out here with him, and she had made the place a home, and then she had gotten sick and died in a week in October 1872, and he had not fully managed to think clearly about what came next until about 6 months ago, when he had realized that Ruth needed more than he could provide alone, and that his own capacity for managing everything was beginning to fray in ways he couldn't afford. He said all of this to the dark yard, not to her particularly, and when he finished there was a silence that was comfortable rather than awkward, which surprised her. She said, "Clara sounds like she was a strong woman." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "She was the kind of strong that didn't announce itself, she just kept going." Eva thought about that. Then she said, "I think that's the only kind of strength that actually works long term." He turned his head and looked at her in the dark, and even in the low light she could see that expression again, the one from the auction, that quality of steadiness. Like he was deciding something or confirming something he had already decided. He said, "I think you might be right about that." She went inside shortly after, but she sat on the edge of her bed for a while before she slept, turning her mother's locket over in her fingers and thinking about a man who had looked her in the eyes before he raised his hand, and what that had cost him, and why he had done it. She had not allowed herself to think about it in terms of anything more than practicality yet. She was not certain she was allowed to. The arrangement was pragmatic, and she was grateful for pragmatic things, and she would not ruin pragmatic with whatever feeling was beginning to gather quietly at the edges of her chest. But she thought about his eyes. 3 weeks into her time at the Double Creek, Ruth spoke her first complete unprompted sentence to Eva. It came on a hot afternoon when Eva was hanging washing, and Ruth was supposed to be napping inside but had clearly been awake for some time, and had decided that the washing line was more interesting. She appeared around the side of the house and watched Eva for a while, and then she said, "Papa looks at you the way he used to look at Mama when he thought she wasn't watching." Eva went still for a moment, a shirt half pinned in her hands. Then she said, "What way is that?" Ruth thought about this seriously, the way small children considered things that adults would have just dismissed. She said, Like he's glad you're there, but he's also a little scared. Eva looked down at the girl standing in the dust with her light hair and her father's eyes, and felt something sharp and sweet move through her chest. She said, "That sounds about right." Ruth nodded as though this confirmed something she had already known, and then walked back inside. Eva finished hanging the washing and stood for a moment in the hot wind, looking at the landscape, at the long grass and the pale sky and the cottonwoods along the creek, and she thought that she had not expected Kansas to look like this. She had expected it to feel like defeat, and it didn't. It felt, improbably, like the edge of something beginning. The trouble arrived in the form of a man named Gideon Holt. Holt ran a ranch about 20 miles to the north and had been, in Cecil's telling when the subject came up, a consistent problem along the territory border for 3 or 4 years. He ran more cattle than his water rights strictly allowed, and he had a habit of letting his herd drift south in the dry summer months, onto land that wasn't his, including the northern edge of the Double Creek Range. Cecil had dealt with this twice before by going to Holt directly, and each time Holt had pulled his cattle back with the particular reluctant compliance of a man who intended to try again next season. Eva learned about this in pieces, the way you learn the geography of a new place, incrementally and through context. She learned it from overhearing conversations between Cecil and Deke on the porch, and from the tight set of Cecil's jaw when he came in from the northern range, and from the fact that the third hand, a young man named Pico who was 17 and eager and slightly reckless, had come back one afternoon with a cut above his eye from an encounter with one of Holt's men near the fence line. She cleaned Pico's cut and asked him what had happened, and he told her, with the slightly embarrassed bluster of a young man who was not quite sure how much he was supposed to minimize for the benefit of a woman, that Holt's foreman, a man called Dutch, had ridden over the fence and said some things about whose land was whose, and Pico had said some things back, and Dutch had introduced his fist to Pico's face by way of conclusion. She finished cleaning the cut and told Pico to stay away from that fence line until Cecil had a chance to deal with it, and Pico looked slightly offended but nodded. She told Cecil about it that evening directly and without embellishment, and Cecil listened with the tight jaw and then said he would ride out to Holt's ranch the following day. She said, "Do you want me to come?" He looked at her. "No," she said. "I'm not asking because I think you can't handle it. I'm asking because 2 people present for a conversation like that changes the dynamic. Holt is the type of man who performs for an audience, and a woman present tends to either make that type more restrained or more theatrical, and it's useful to know which kind he is." Cecil stared at her for a moment. Then he said, "How do you know what kind of man Holt is?" She said, "I don't know what kind exactly. I'm suggesting we find out." He thought about this for long enough that she was fairly sure he was going to say no again. Then he said, "All right, we'll ride out at first light." Gideon Holt was a large man with a red face and the kind of authority that was all performance, the kind that crumbled if you didn't react to it the way it expected. He came out of his main house when Cecil and Eva rode up, and his eyes went to Eva with a look that was appraising and proprietary in a way that made her want to wash it off. But she kept her expression neutral and let him do his assessing. Cecil handled the conversation with the same low, unhurried tone he used for everything, stating the situation plainly and saying that he needed Holt's cattle pulled back from the Double Creek Range, and that he needed Dutch to understand that putting his hands on Cecil's people was not going to become a habit. Holt blustered. He talked about water rights and territory and seasonal drift, and his grandfather's history with Kansas, like his grandfather's history had anything to do with the current conversation. Eva waited until Holt had run down enough to pause, and then she said, "Mr. Holt, the line between your range and ours is documented at the county seat. I checked the records last week." She had not, but Holt didn't know that, and it was the kind of thing that could be easily verified in his disfavor if he pushed it, which she was counting on him being smart enough to understand. If there's a continued dispute about the boundary, the obvious solution is to ride out together and walk the line. That way there's no ambiguity for either party. Holt looked at her. There was a calculation happening behind his eyes. She said, or we can take it to the county sheriff, but that seems like a lot of time for both sides when a fence-line walk would settle it in an afternoon. Holt decided that morning not to be theatrical. He looked at Cecil and said, with the grudging compliance of a man who recognized that he was not going to win this particular moment without making it much larger than it needed to be, that Dutch would be spoken to and that the cattle would be moved by week's end. On the ride back, Cecil said nothing for about a mile. Then he said, "How did you know he'd back down at the county records?" She said, "Men who perform authority don't like paperwork. It takes the performance out of it." He was quiet for another half-mile. Then he said, "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," she said. "You gave me credit for being sensible and capable, which was the correct assessment at the time. You just didn't know yet what else was there." He turned to look at her on that flat open road with the sun already high and the grass rippling out on both sides, and there was something different in his expression now, something beyond the steadiness, something that was beginning to warm around the edges. He said, "I'm noticing more all the time." She looked back at the road ahead, but she was smiling and she didn't try to hide it. That night after supper, after Ruth had been put to bed and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, Cecil and Eva sat at the kitchen table over the remains of coffee, and Cecil said, "I want to ask you something and I want you to answer honestly, even if the answer isn't what I'd prefer." She said, "All right." He said, "Are you content here? Not comfortable, I know the house is fine. I mean content. Is this something you could see yourself wanting to continue?" She turned her coffee cup in her hands for a moment. Then she said, "I've been asking myself the same question." He said, "What have you answered yourself?" She looked up at him. "I'm getting there," she said. "I think I'm getting there faster than I expected." He held her gaze and she held his, and between them something turned, like a page turning, like a season changing, like water beginning to run in a creek that had been dry. He said, "I'd like to court you properly. I know that's backward given that you're already living in my house, but I'd like to do it properly anyway if you're willing." She said, "What does properly look like to you?" He thought about this with the earnestness she was coming to recognize as one of his fundamental qualities, the way he gave serious thought to things rather than just defaulting to the obvious answer. "I'd like to take you into Caldwell on Saturday, have supper at the hotel dining room, ask you things I don't know about you yet, and tell you things about myself that I haven't had an occasion to say." She said, "That sounds proper." He said, "I'd like to do it regularly until we both know what this is." She said, "I think I already have some sense of what this is." He said, "So do I, but I'd like to be sure. I'd like you to be sure." She said, "That's a very careful way to proceed." He said, "I've had cause to be careful about things I care about." The silence after that was different from all the other silences. It had a weight to it, a presence, the kind that two people made together when they were both standing at the same edge and both deciding whether to step forward. She said, "Saturday then." He said, "Saturday." And something that had been gathering in the space between them since the auction square settled into something it had been working toward all along. Saturday came with the particular quality of anticipation that Eva had not felt in years, a lightness in her chest that she examined with faint suspicion, because she had learned not to trust lightness. But she put on her best dress, which was the green one that was least faded, and pinned her hair carefully and wore her mother's locket, and when she came out to the porch where Cecil was waiting with the wagon, already cleaned and wearing a clean shirt himself and a newer-looking hat, she saw him look at her in a way that was immediate and unguarded before he had time to make it into something more measured. He said, "You look very fine, Miss Townsend." She said, "You can call me Eva." He said, "You look very fine, Eva." And something in the way he said her name made her feel, briefly, like she was standing somewhere solid after a long time of uncertain ground. Ruth had been left in the care of the Hockin family next ranch over, the neighbors who had kept her while Cecil was in Caldwell. Their oldest girl, a 12-year-old named Ingrid, had quickly become Ruth's closest companion in the absence of other children nearby, and Ruth had gone without complaint, which was its own kind of progress. The drive to Caldwell took just under 2 hours, and they talked for most of it, the conversation moving through her childhood in Wichita, which she described in careful detail for the first time to anyone, the farmhouse and her father's work, and the particular quality of early Kansas autumn. Cecil told her about Tennessee, about the mountains compared to the flat land, about how long it had taken him to stop looking for hills on the horizon. He told her about building the Double Creek's first structure, a lean-to shelter for himself and his horse, in November, which had been cold enough to make the whole venture feel heroic and foolish in equal measure. She laughed at that, a genuine laugh that came up from somewhere real, and he looked at her sideways with an expression that she was beginning to learn meant he was storing something, filing it away in the careful inventory he kept of things that mattered. Caldwell's hotel dining room was not a grand establishment by any standard, but it had tablecloths that were clean and a woman cooking in the back who knew what she was doing with beef and potatoes, and there were candles on the tables because the owner's wife believed in them on principle. Cecil had made a reservation, which had required coming into town the day before and asking the hotel clerk, which Eva learned only later and which made her throat do something complicated. They ate slowly and talked for 2 hours, and the things they said moved gradually from the surface to the depth, the way conversations did when both people were genuinely interested and not performing interest. He asked her what she had loved before everything went wrong, before the debt and the farm and the long year of losing things, and she had to think about it for a moment because she had not let herself consider that question in so long. She said, "Books. My father had 8 books. I read them until I had them more or less memorized. I loved the way stories made me feel like the world was larger than the land we could see from the porch." He said, "What 8 books?" She told him, and one of them made him say that he had read it too, a collection of adventure stories his aunt had sent him from Nashville when he was 12, and they talked about those stories with a shared pleasure that felt, in that candle-lit dining room, like something that had been waiting to happen. He told her that what he had loved before Clara got sick and the ranch absorbed everything was music. He had played the fiddle passably well and had once spent a winter Saturday with a group of men in a barn outside Nashville playing until 3 in the morning. He had not played since Clara died. The fiddle was still in the chest in the storage room. She said, "You should play again." He said, "Maybe," she said, "not for my sake, for yours. Things like that shouldn't stay put away just because they hurt to think about." He looked at her over the candlelight with an expression so open and unguarded that she felt it like a physical warmth. He said, "Clara used to say something similar," she said. "Then she was a wise woman." He said, "You are too," she said. "I've had a lot of practice at surviving things. It develops a certain kind of clarity." He said, "I'd rather you had been spared the need for that kind of clarity," she said. "So would I, but since I wasn't, I'd rather use it than waste it." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she let him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the candle between them burned steadily in the still air of the dining room, and outside the summer night had gone soft and dark, and Caldwell's Main Street moved at its usual evening pace. And none of that mattered particularly, because inside this room something was completing itself between two people who had both had a great deal taken from them and were, cautiously and surely, beginning to build something new. The weeks that followed had a quality of unfolding. That was the best word Eva could find for it, the sense of something opening gradually, each day revealing another small piece of what this life could contain. The Saturday suppers in Caldwell became a fixed point in the week, an occasion they both prepared for with a care that would have been invisible to outside eyes but was completely legible to each other. Ruth noticed her father's Saturday preparations with the solemnity of a child compiling evidence, and said nothing about it, but began helping Eva with her hair on Saturday mornings, which was its own kind of endorsement. The fiddle came out of the chest on a Wednesday evening in late July. Eva had not asked about it again after that dinner. She had filed the information away and left it alone. But Cecil had apparently been thinking about it, because he brought it out after supper while Eva was reading at the table and Ruth was already asleep, and he sat in the chair by the fireplace and held it for a while without playing, just held it, and Eva kept her eyes on her book and did not comment. Then he drew the bow across the strings once, a tentative thing, and adjusted the tuning with the focused attention of someone returning to a skill they had not lost but had not used. And then he played a simple melody, nothing formal, just something that moved up and down with a natural ease, and Eva looked up from her book over the rim of the page. His eyes were closed while he played. She set the book in her lap and watched him, this quiet and careful man who had looked at her in the eyes in an auction square, and raised his hand with $80 and the particular courage of someone who had decided to try again at a life he had thought was over. And she felt something in her chest that was not careful and not measured, and was not looking to become either. When he opened his eyes and saw her watching, he did not stop playing. He held her gaze and kept playing, and the music filled the small, warm room, and outside the Kansas night was full of crickets and the distant sound of cattle and the creak of the cottonwoods along the creek, and Eva Townsend thought that whatever she had been frightened of feeling, she was done being frightened of it. She said softly, so as not to disturb the music too much, "That's beautiful." He said without stopping, "I thought I'd forgot." She said, "You didn't." He said, "No." She said, "Some things stay even when you think they're gone." He looked at her across the room and stopped playing. Not abruptly, but in the natural way a song ended, and the silence was a full one. He said, "Eva." She said, "Yes." He said, "I'm in love with you. I wanted you to know that plainly rather than obliquely, because I think you deserve plain things said to you after a long time of things being hard and uncertain. I'm in love with you, and I would very much like to marry you if you're willing, and not as a practical arrangement but as a real thing, as the real thing it already is for me." She stood up from the table and walked across the room to where he was sitting, and she stood in front of him and looked at him with the kind of directness that she had always had, and that he had been the first man in a long time to meet properly, and she said, "Cecil Ford, I fell in love with you somewhere around the third week when you told your daughter that I was allowed to rearrange the kitchen however I pleased, because it was my kitchen now, and I have been waiting for you to say something plain ever since." He set the fiddle very carefully against the arm of the chair and stood up, and he was looking at her in a way that made all the careful steadiness in his face open into something warmer and less guarded than she had seen in it before. He said, "Will you marry me?" She said, "Yes." He cupped her face in both his hands, calloused hands that were gentle in the way only very strong hands could be gentle, and kissed her, and she kissed him back without reservation, without the caution she had been exercising for months, and it was a long moment and a complete one, and when it ended they were both standing in the warm lamplight of the Double Creek's main room, with the fiddle leaning against the chair and the cricket song coming through the window. And they were both slightly undone, and neither of them minded. Ruth, as it turned out, had been awake the whole time and had heard everything from behind her half-closed door, because she appeared in the doorway with a look of comprehensive satisfaction and said, "I knew it." Cecil turned and looked at his daughter with an expression that was trying very hard to be stern and was entirely failing. He said, "You were supposed to be asleep." She said, "Is Eva going to be my mother now?" The word landed in the room with a particular weight. Eva felt it and Cecil felt it, and they both looked at Ruth standing in the doorway in her nightgown with her light hair loose, and Eva crossed the room and crouched down in front of her, which brought her to eye level with the girl, and she said, "Your mother was Clara and she always will be. I'm Eva, and I love your father and I love you, and if you want me to be part of your family I would be very honored by that." Ruth looked at her for a long, serious moment. Then she said, "Can I call you Mama Eva?" "So it's different," Eva said. "I would love that." Ruth nodded with the finality of a decision made and then walked back to her room, A moment later, they heard her get back into bed. Cecil and Eva looked at each other. He said, "She has been lobbying for this situation for some time." Eva said, "I know. She told me you looked at me the way you used to look at Clara when you thought she wasn't watching." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's right." Eva said, "I know she's right." They were married 3 weeks later in Caldwell, in a simple ceremony at the small wooden church on the east side of the main street, with a minister who had been conducting services in Caldwell for 6 years and who treated the proceedings with the appropriate gravity. The witnesses were Deke and a woman named Sarah Hawken from the neighboring ranch, who had become something of a friend to Eva in the preceding weeks and who cried in a cheerful, practical way throughout the ceremony. Pico had polished his boots for the occasion and stood in the back trying to look unsentimental with limited success. Ruth stood beside Eva at the altar and held her hand during the vows, which had not been planned but which happened naturally, and which the minister accommodated without comment, because he was a sensible man. Cecil said his vows in the low, steady voice that Eva had come to know as his most serious voice, the one that meant he had thought carefully about what he was saying and meant every word of it. He looked at her while he said them the way he had looked at her in the auction square, directly, with full attention, without looking away. She said her vows and did not drop her eyes either. When the minister pronounced them married and Cecil kissed her in the small wooden church with the summer light coming through the plain glass windows, she felt something settle in her bones that had not been settled in a very long time. Not relief exactly, though that was there. Something more fundamental. Something that felt like the end of a long walk and the sight of somewhere you recognized as home. The reception, such as it was, happened at the Hawken Ranch because it was larger, with food provided by Sarah Hawken and 2 other neighboring women who appeared with covered dishes, and an enthusiasm for the occasion that Eva found deeply moving. There was music, 2 men with a guitar and a harmonica who played on the porch. Cecil danced with her to a slow, simple tune in the yard, while the sun went down over the plains, his hand warm at her back, her hand in his. And she thought that she had danced almost never in her life, and had not understood until now that it was a form of conversation, the way bodies could say things that words moved around rather than through. Ruth danced with Ingrid Hawken on the porch and conducted herself with a gravity appropriate to the occasion, which is to say she was more or less glowing. They rode back to the double creek in the full dark, Ruth asleep against Eva's shoulder in the wagon, the stars enormous overhead, and Cecil drove in a silence that was the best kind, the kind that contained everything rather than avoiding it. At some point, his hand found hers on the seat between them and stayed there the whole rest of the drive home. The life they built together at the double creek in the months that followed had a texture and a depth that Eva would later try to describe to Ruth when Ruth was grown, and asked how people knew when a thing was real. She would say that real things had weight and texture, that they had the quality of continuing to be interesting, and knew even after the initial urgency had settled. That Cecil, whom she had married out of necessity and fallen in love with out of something far less explicable and far more important, remained consistently interesting to her because he was a man of substance, and substance didn't exhaust itself. She had not expected, when she stood on that platform in the June heat and refused to let her spine bend, that the man who looked at her eyes rather than her figure was going to be the answer to all the questions her life had accumulated. She was not naive enough to believe that love solved everything, because the ranch was still hard work, and the winters were unforgiving, and there were still difficult seasons ahead. But she believed, with the full-bodied certainty of someone who had learned the difference between pragmatic arrangement and genuine feeling, that having the right person beside you changed the fundamental nature of difficulty, made it bearable, made it, sometimes, into something that built rather than eroded. The autumn of 1874 brought good cattle prices and enough rain to finish the season well, and Cecil came in from the range most evenings with the specific tiredness of someone who was working toward something rather than just working. And they sat on the porch in the cooling dark after Ruth was in bed and talked, or didn't talk, with equal comfort. She had written a letter to Martha Greer in Wichita that fall, a long one, telling her the situation. Martha had written back a short reply that said, simply, that she was glad it had turned out to be a man worth the $80. Gideon Holt moved his cattle as promised and stayed on his side of the line for the remainder of that season, which Cecil credited to Eva's county record's bluff, which he had found out about in subsequent weeks, and which had made him laugh in the sudden, genuine way that came over him sometimes, the way that Ruth had her father's eyes. Dutch, the foreman, left Holt's employ by October under circumstances no one fully explained, and was replaced by a quieter man who kept to his own range without incident. Pico turned 18 in November and was given a small increase in his wages and a slightly better horse, which Deke agreed was warranted, and which Pico received with the elaborate nonchalance of a young man who was deeply pleased. He had started coming to supper at the main house sometimes on Sundays, because Eva cooked enough for everyone, and because she had decided that a boy that far from his family deserved a proper meal on the Lord's Day, and Deke came sometimes too, and the table that had been quiet for too long developed a noise that felt like health. By December, Eva knew she was expecting. She told Cecil on a Saturday evening, on the porch, in the cold, clear air of early winter, with the stars very bright and the grass stiff with frost. She said it directly, as she said most things, and she watched his face do something she had not seen it do before, which was to become completely undone in the best possible way, all the careful steadiness dissolving into something that was pure and uncomplicated joy. He stood up from his chair and pulled her up and held her in both arms in the cold night air, not kissing her, just holding her, his face against her hair, and she felt his chest move with a breath that was long and deep. He said into her hair, "Are you all right?" "Are you feeling well?" she said. "I feel fine, better than fine." He held her for a while longer. Then he pulled back enough to look at her face. He said, "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me as though I did this alone." He said, "Thank you for being here. Thank you for being you." She looked at him in the cold starlight and thought about the auction platform and the summer heat and the man who had looked at her eyes, and she said, "Thank you for looking at me before you bid." He tilted his head slightly, and she could see him turning that over. He said, "I had to know if you were all right, if you were there of your own choosing as much as a person can be in that situation. I had to know you as a person before I made a decision that affected you," she said. "I know. That's why I married you." Ruth was told about the baby the next morning, and her response was to be deeply thoughtful for approximately 20 minutes and then to announce that if it was a boy, she wanted to name him James, and if it was a girl, she wanted to name her Lucy. She had clearly been considering the possibility of siblings for some time and had prepared her positions. Cecil and Eva exchanged a look over her head that contained approximately 4 different kinds of amusement and tenderness. They told her that James and Lucy were both fine names. The winter settled in properly in January, and the ranch took on the particular quality of winter life on the prairie, which was its own kind of world. The days were short and the work was cold, and the house was warm at the center of it all. A warmth that was not just the stone fireplace, but the accumulated warmth of people who were glad to be in the same place together. Cecil played the fiddle on winter evenings, and sometimes Eva sang along to the ones she knew, which she hadn't done in years, and which turned out to be a pleasure of a kind she had forgotten was available to her. Ruth fell asleep to fiddle music most nights and would, much later in her life, tell her own children that she couldn't hear a fiddle without feeling immediately safe. Deke, who was not a sentimental man by any definition of the word, told Pico one cold morning in February while they were mending fence that the Double Creek was a different place than it had been 2 years ago, and that different was the right word for it. Pico agreed with the enthusiasm of the young. Cecil and Eva had the conversation, one January evening, about what the proper legal standing of their marriage was and what it meant for the ranch. Cecil had put the double creek in both their names without ceremony, just had the paperwork drawn up in Caldwell and brought it home one evening and put it on the table and said that it seemed right. Eva had looked at the document for a long moment and then looked at him and said that it seemed right to her too, and that had been the end of that conversation. She had not expected generosity of that scope from a practical arrangement. But then again, she had understood for some time that this had stopped being a practical arrangement and had become something real, and real things operated by different rules. The spring of 1875 came in warm and early, and the creek beds filled with snowmelt, and the grass came up green, and the cattle began calving in the lower pasture. And Eva's pregnancy progressed with the particular tyranny of the first several months giving way to the steadier comfort of the middle months. She was capable and she worked hard, and Cecil tried, with only moderate success, to convince her to rest more than she did, and she tolerated his concern with a degree of patience that she considered generous and he considered slightly insufficient. She expanded the vegetable garden significantly in April, adding a row of corn and one of beans alongside the existing crops, with help from Ruth, who had decided that gardening was an acceptable activity for a girl of her standing, and applied herself to it with considerable dedication. The garden became a project they shared, the three of them sometimes, on slow evenings when Cecil had time, kneeling in the dirt and talking about ordinary things, and Eva thought that ordinary things, given the right company, were extraordinary. The Hawken family came to supper in May, all six of them, in celebration of nothing in particular beyond the fact that the weather was fine and Sarah Hawken had taken Eva for a true friend by this point, and friends needed occasions to eat together. Ruth and Ingrid disappeared into the barn for most of the evening on business they considered private. The adults sat on the porch and the men talked cattle, and the women talked gardens and medicine, and the practicalities of frontier life. And then they all talked together about the territory and the news that came up from the south and the steady creep of settlement, and what it meant for the land, and the people who had been there longer. Arne Hawken, Sarah's husband, was a thoughtful Norwegian man who had opinions about the treatment of the Comanche and the Osage, and the other peoples whose land this had been before the settlers came, and he expressed them with the directness of a man who had come from outside the American cultural assumption that settlement was simply progress, and that the people displaced were not worth the full weight of consideration. Cecil agreed with more of it than he said out loud, because he was a careful man, but Eva said what she thought plainly, which was that the injustice of what had been done and was being done to the people native to this land was real and documented, and that the fact of it sat uncomfortably alongside the fact of her own presence here, which was built on land that had been cleared by means she had not consented to but benefited from. She said it was not enough to be troubled by it privately. She said it ought to change how people conducted themselves. Arne raised his glass to that. Cecil looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as the inventory look, the one that meant he was adding something to what he knew of her. Later, when the Hawkins had gone home and Ruth was in bed and they were cleaning up in the kitchen, he said, "You meant that, about the land," she said. "Of course I meant it," he said. "I've thought about it too, more than I've said," she said. "You should say it," he said. "I'm not sure what saying it accomplishes without action." She said, "Saying it is the beginning of the action, and it matters that people hear it said by the people who benefit." He nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about whether there are ways to work with some of the Osage traders who come through the territory line. Fair exchange, proper negotiation, not the way it's usually done," she said. "That sounds like the beginning of an action to me." He said, "You make things clearer," she said. "You make things more considered. Between the two of us we might actually manage something worthwhile." He smiled at her, which he did more now than he had when she first came, the smiles coming easier and more often, and she thought that was one of the best things about watching someone feel safe again, the way their face opened up. The baby was born in early August of 1875, in the bedroom of the Double Creek, Maine house, with the assistance of a midwife named Mrs. Callaghan, who rode out from Caldwell, and who had, in her estimation, delivered approximately 300 babies in her career, and had strong opinions about almost everything related to the process. Cecil was made to wait on the porch by Mrs. Callaghan, who felt that fathers underfoot were a hindrance, and he sat on the porch for 4 hours in the August night and carved a small wooden horse from a piece of cottonwood branch with hands that were not quite steady. It was a boy. He was born at just past midnight, and he cried immediately, and with the conviction of someone who had decided to make his presence known, and Mrs. Callaghan said he was fine and healthy, and Eva was fine and exhausted. Cecil was allowed in after another 20 minutes that felt considerably longer. He came in and found Eva sitting up in bed, pale and wrung out, and looking at the small wrapped bundle in her arms with an expression of absolute concentrated love that he would carry in his memory for the rest of his life. She looked up and said, "Come meet your son." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who had dark hair like Cecil and a round, ferocious face that seemed to be taking its time assessing the world it had arrived in. He reached out and the baby wrapped a small hand around Cecil's finger without opening his eyes, and Cecil sat there with this grip on his finger and his wife beside him in the lamplight, and did not have words for what he was feeling because the words were all inadequate. Eva said, "I'd like to name him James, if you agree." "For my father," he said. "James Ford, yes, that's right." She leaned against his shoulder with the baby between them, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the still August night with the creak sounds coming through the window and the new life in their hands. Ruth was told in the morning. She came into the bedroom with the solemnity of someone approaching a significant occasion, looked at James Ford with serious dark eyes, and then said, "He looks like Papa," which Eva confirmed, and then said, "He's smaller than I expected," which Mrs. Callaghan, still present and making tea in the kitchen, called out that they always were. Ruth sat beside the bed for a long time that day, watching her brother with the focused attention she brought to everything, and slowly, over the following days, began helping in the small ways that 7-year-olds could help, fetching things and keeping herself quiet when the baby was sleeping, and eventually singing to him when he cried, a tuneless but earnest effort that had the improbable effect of actually working. Cecil saw this from the doorway one evening and stood there long enough that Eva came to stand beside him, and they watched their daughter sing their son to sleep, and the moment was so complete that neither of them said anything about it afterward. It was a thing that didn't need words. The fall of 1875 was good. The cattle sold well at the Caldwell market, and the herd was healthy, and Cecil and Arne Hocken had, true to Cecil's intention, established a trading arrangement with an Osage family who came through the territory line in September with horses and furs. The arrangement was conducted with the fairness Cecil had specified, and it went well enough that both parties agreed to repeat it in the spring. It was a small thing, but it was the kind of small thing that could grow into something larger if tended carefully, and both Cecil and Eva intended to tend it. Deke, who had been at the Double Creek since before Clara died, and who had watched everything that had happened in the preceding year and a half with the quiet attention of a man who said little but observed everything, told Cecil one October morning while they were moving cattle that Mrs. Ford was the best thing that had happened to this ranch since the first creek ran. Cecil said, "She's the best thing that's happened to me in my life." Deke considered this and then said, "That too." The winter of 1875 was harder than the previous one, with cold that came in early November and stayed in snowfall that kept everyone closer to home than usual. But the house was warm and the stores were well stocked because Eva had planned for winter with the methodical thoroughness that she applied to problems, and the months passed with the quality of being sealed in together, which turned out to be a gift rather than a deprivation. Cecil taught Ruth to read music that winter, sitting with her at the kitchen table with paper and a pencil, teaching her to follow the notation while he played on the fiddle. Ruth was determined and quick, and by February she could follow simple melodies on the paper while her father played them, and she declared her intention to learn the fiddle herself, which Cecil said he would teach her in the spring when his fingers weren't stiff from the cold. Eva read aloud in the evenings, working through the few books they had and adding 2 more that she ordered through the general store in Caldwell, a feat that required sending money and waiting 6 weeks, and then riding in on a cold December day to collect the package, which she did without telling Cecil and came home with them hidden under her coat, presenting them at supper like a slight mystery until Ruth spotted the shapes. James grew with the impatient speed of healthy babies, moving through his first months with the determination of someone who had places to be, sitting up early, observing the world around him with the same focused attention that characterized his older sister, though his dark eyes had his father's quality of watching and waiting rather than Ruth's quality of cataloging and judging. By winter, he was in the habit of watching Cecil's face with a concentration that made Cecil feel, as he told Eva one evening, like he was being studied for a test. Eva laughed and said that he was. Pico left the Double Creek in the spring of 1876, not under difficult circumstances, but because a cousin of his in New Mexico had written with news of work on a larger outfit further south, and Pico was at the age when the farther horizon always looked more interesting than the near one. He left with good wages and Cecil's recommendation, and a large supper that Eva made for the occasion, during which he was slightly embarrassed by the fuss and deeply grateful for it. He shook Cecil's hand and tipped his hat to Eva and told Ruth that she was going to be a fine rancher someday, which Ruth received with appropriate seriousness. His replacement was a young man named Theo Marsh, who arrived from Caldwell with 1 bedroll and the reference of a man Cecil had known for several years, and who proved, over the following weeks, to be quieter than Pico but more consistently reliable. He and Deke reached an accommodation with each other that involved almost no conversation and apparently worked for both parties. The spring of 1876 was eventful in ways that had nothing to do with the Double Creek specifically, and everything to do with the territory around it. News came up from the south of troubles with the Comanche and Kiowa, the last straining against the constrictions of the reservation policy that had been imposed on them, and from the north there was the news of the Black Hills and the Sioux, and the summer that everyone had begun to call catastrophic by July. Cecil and Arne Hawkins sat on the porch one evening in June and talked about it with the gravity it warranted, and Eva listened and contributed, and the conversation had the quality of people trying to reckon honestly with the world they were living in and their place in it. Cecil had, by this point, established enough of a relationship with the Osage traders to have learned some things he had not known before about the history of the land he stood on, and he had found a way to hold that knowledge that was neither paralyzing nor complacent. He held it the way Eva had suggested, as an obligation to be better in his conduct than the history required him to be, and he thought it was the kind of obligation that could only be paid off over a long time with consistent small actions rather than any single large gesture. Eva thought that this was the most honest way she had ever heard a man describe the debt, and she said so. He said he'd had a good teacher. She said she'd had a good student. James turned 1 in August of 1876, which was celebrated with a small gathering that was mostly Ruth's enthusiasm, who had decided that her brother's first birthday was an occasion requiring decorations, and who had made paper flags out of old newspaper and hung them along the porch with a solemn commitment to festivity that amused all the adults and impressed Mrs. Hawkins, who said Ruth had a flair for ceremony. The summer of 1876 brought Ruth a new thing, which was school. Caldwell had established a small school the previous year, and it met 4 days a week, and was taught by a woman named Miss Alderton, who had come from Ohio, and was approximately 22 years old and completely certain of the importance of her work, which made her excellent at it. Ruth went to school with Ingrid Hawkins on the Hawkins wagon, and came home full of information and opinions that she expressed at supper, with the focused intensity of someone who had found a mechanism that matched her capacity. Cecil listened to his daughter's school reports with the slightly dazed expression of a man who was deeply proud and slightly outpaced, which Eva found endlessly charming. She told him one evening, while Ruth was telling them about the history of the Louisiana Purchase with a degree of personal investment that suggested she had feelings about it, that she thought Ruth was going to need a larger world than Caldwell eventually. He said, "I know, I've been thinking about it," she said. "Good schools in Wichita or further east." He said, "Not yet, she's 8. She said, "Not yet, but we should be planning." He said, "We are planning, look at us planning things." She said, "We are quite good at it." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his in the familiar way, the same gesture as the candle-lit dining room in Caldwell, now worn smooth with repetition into something that was the language they kept between them, and she turned her hand palm up under his and held on. Across the table, Ruth finished her summary of the Louisiana Purchase and said, "Are you two even listening?" They were. The years moved the way years did on the prairie, with the seasons doing their full and serious work, each one bringing its own quality of beauty and difficulty. The Double Creek continued to grow, not dramatically but steadily, which was the better kind of growth in Cecil's estimation. He added 50 head to the herd in 1877 and built a larger barn with the help of the Hawkins men, and a weekend work party that Eva had organized with the efficiency she brought to all logistics, resulting in a barn raising that was also something close to a party, with food and music and children running in the yard. James learned to walk in the late fall of 1876 and proceeded to apply his new skill to the most inconvenient possible applications, which kept Eva considerably occupied, and which Ruth supervised with the protective intensity of an older sibling who had decided this small person was her specific responsibility. Eva found out she was expecting again in the early spring of 1877 and told Cecil in the same place she had told him about James, on the porch in the evening, though this time the air was warm rather than cold. His face did the same thing it had done the first time, the complete dissolving of his steadiness into uncomplicated joy, and she thought that this was one of the things she would always love most about him, that happiness didn't make him guarded, that good things arrived in his face without reservation. He said, "How are you feeling?" She said, "Tired, good." He said, "I'll take over the heavy work." She said, "You always say that." He said, "You always do it anyway." She said, "Because someone has to." He said, "We could let someone else." She said, "I'll let you know if I need to." He said, "You won't let me know. You'll just manage until you fall over and then tell me you're fine." She said, "That's an accurate portrait of me." He said, "I know you." She looked at him in the evening light, this man who had been a stranger at an auction a little under 3 years ago and was now the architecture of her daily life, the person whose voice she heard first in the morning and whose face was the last thing she thought of at night, and she said, "You do. Better than anyone ever has." He said, "That's a responsibility I take seriously." She said, "I know you do. That's why I told you." The second baby was a girl, born in October of 1877, with Eva's dark hair and a disposition that announced itself immediately as considerably more audible than her brother's. She came into the world with strong opinions about the experience, which Mrs. Callaghan, making her second appearance at the Double Creek for this purpose, said was an excellent sign of vitality. Ruth, now 9, stood in the doorway of the bedroom with wide eyes as the first sounds of her sister reached her, and then looked at her father, who was sitting on the porch step outside the window, and said, "She's loud." He said, "She is." Ruth said, "She gets that from Mama Eva." Cecil made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a cough. The baby was named Anna, for no one in particular but because Eva said the name had a solid sound to it. And James, at 14 months, was introduced to his sister the following morning with a gravity he'd been prepared for by Ruth, who had spent the preceding weeks explaining to him what was coming in terms of sibling relationships that were probably more sophisticated than he was ready for at his age, but that he had listened to very carefully with his father's expression of attentive consideration. He looked at Anna for a long time. Then he patted her hand with his very gently and looked at Eva, and Eva said, "That's your sister." And James said one of his small collection of current words, which was "mine." And everyone in the room felt that this was exactly the right response. The Double Creek in the autumn of 1877 was a place that had been built into a home over the preceding 3 years, with the accumulated effort and love of two people who had found each other through circumstances that neither of them would have chosen, and both of them were grateful for. The house was warm and well kept. The yard had a quality of lived-in abundance. The garden had grown to include an apple tree that was still young but already promising. The Hands had their bunkhouse and their routine, Deke solid and constant as the landscape itself, and Theo having settled into the place with the comfortable permanence of someone who had decided this was where he would stay. Ruth went to school 4 days a week and came home full of the world, and in the evenings Cecil taught her fiddle as promised, and she was learning with the determined focus she brought to everything, already able to coax recognizable melodies out of the instrument that had sat in a chest for 2 years before Eva arrived, and told a man who had gone quiet inside himself that some things stayed even when you thought they were gone. James grew into a dark-eyed, thoughtful toddler who followed his father around the yard with the specific dedication of a small person who had identified his primary point of orientation in the world and was not going to let it out of sight. Cecil carried him on one arm while doing yard work with a naturalness that spoke to how completely he had settled back into the role of father, not as something he had to find again, but as something that had been waiting for him to remember it was his. Anna was 4 months old and loud and strong, and looking at the world with Eva's direct gaze and the expression of someone who was already building opinions. Eva stood at the kitchen window one November morning, while James played on the porch and Anna slept in the small cradle near the hearth, and the sounds of Ruth's fiddle practice came from the main room in tentative but improving runs, and she watched Cecil crossing the yard from the barn in the bright fall light, and she thought about the woman who had stood on an auction platform in June heat with her spine straight and her hands folded, and no good options visible on any horizon. She thought about how that woman could not have imagined this morning, could not have believed, in the hard pragmatic geometry of that summer, that the man who looked at her eyes before he raised his hand was going to be the answer to every question she hadn't yet figured out how to ask, that he was going to be someone who played the fiddle and said plain things and looked at her across rooms in a way that never exhausted itself, that he was going to give her a daughter who sang to her brother and a son who patted his sister's hand and called her his, and a home that had grown from nothing she had expected into everything she hadn't known she was missing. Cecil came in the back door and found her at the window and came to stand beside her, and she leaned into him in the way that had become as natural as breathing, and his arm came around her shoulders. He said, "What are you thinking?" she said. "I'm thinking that some things turn out to be better than you thought they could." He said, "Some things do," she said. "I didn't think I'd get to have this." He said, "Neither did I." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the expression she had first seen in the auction square, the steadiness, the attention, the full presence of a man who looked at people rather than through them. Only now it was warmer, had been warmed by 3 years and 2 children and 1,000 evenings on the porch and a fiddle played back to life, and a garden grown from almost nothing, and a daughter who called her Mama Eva with a completeness that had healed something in Eva she hadn't fully known was broken. She said, "Thank you for looking at me," he said. "Thank you for looking back." She kissed him in the morning light of their kitchen, with Anna asleep by the fire and James talking quietly to himself on the porch and Ruth's fiddle sending its careful notes through the house. And outside, the November sky was that particular blue that only happened over the Kansas plains in the cold, clear light of autumn, enormous and clean. And the cottonwoods along the Double Creek had gone gold, and the cattle were settled in the lower pasture, and the world was as it should be. The morning continued as mornings did, with its ordinary requirements of food and work and children and tending. And Eva and Cecil moved through it together with the ease of people who had learned each other fully enough to move in the same space without collision, who had built something sturdy enough to hold them both and everything they had made together. By noon, Ruth had mastered a new measure of her fiddle piece and played it for James, who applauded with the enthusiasm of a 1-year-old, which is to say, with his whole body. Anna woke and made her opinions about waking known at considerable volume, and Eva fed her and walked with her, and told her about the world outside the window in the unhurried way of a mother with enough time, and enough peace to offer her child the full attention of her. Cecil came in for lunch and ate with his family at the table that had once been quiet, and was now the opposite of quiet, and he looked at his wife and his children, and the life that had assembled itself around a single moment of choice. A man standing at the edge of a crowd deciding to bid, deciding to look first before he raised his hand, and he thought that every good thing he had could be traced back to that particular act of decency, that impulse to see the person before the circumstance, to look into her eyes rather than at her price. And Eva Townsend Ford, who had stood on a platform in the summer heat of 1874, with no good options and a straight spine, and the full weight of an uncertain world pressing down on her, sat at her table in her house on her land with her husband's hand warm over hers and her children's voices filling every corner of the room. And she thought that life, handled with enough stubbornness and enough luck, and one exact right moment of being truly seen by someone who looked before he acted, could turn out to be a very fine and full and beautiful thing. And it had, and it was, and she intended to spend a very long time being grateful for every piece of it. The Double Creek Ranch stood for many decades after that first summer, and grew, and was eventually home to grandchildren who ran in the same yard and swam in the same 2 creeks that had given the place its name. And the cottonwood trees grew taller, and Ruth learned to play the fiddle properly and taught her own daughter years later. And James became a man with his father's steadiness and his mother's directness, and turned out to be exactly the kind of rancher who looked at problems the way his father had looked at people, fully, before he acted. Anna grew up loud and decided and brilliant and left Kansas eventually for a larger world, and wrote letters home that made Eva laugh and made Cecil shake his head, and made both of them so proud it was a kind of ache. And through all of it, through the seasons and the years and the ordinary extraordinary accumulation of a life built together, Cecil Ford remained the man who had looked Eva Townsend in the eyes before he raised his hand, and she remained the woman who had looked back. And between them, there was something that had been built not from romance alone, though it was romantic, but from the bedrock of 2 people who had decided to see each other fully and to keep deciding it every day for the rest of their lives. That was how it happened, that was the whole of it, and it was more than enough.